William Adams stood proudly next to his wife Lillian, with his arm firmly wrapped around her shoulder. The pair had just accomplished one of their lifelong dreams in owning their own property, a place where they, along with their children and family dog, were able to finally call home. It wasn't brand new by any means. The old building had a few years on her, evidence of a few paint chips here and there and a bit of wear on the walls, but that didn't matter to them. This was their home now, and the sweat and tears they would put into fixing it was going to be well worth the trouble. Problem was, when they finally finished moving their last piece of furniture, the family was surprised to find they were not the only residents to call the house their home. Sometimes, due to unforeseen circumstances, our dreams can come crashing down before we even get a chance to enjoy them. For William Adams and his family, their dream quickly became a nightmare. Over the years, the city of Detroit has cultivated a reputation for being rather dangerous. Although there are many who would say that about many cities in the United States nowadays, but what those other cities don't have, that Detroit does, is the modest house located at 5508 Martin Street. It's here in the early 1960s our story takes place, and where we find William, his wife Lillian, and their 5 children finally unpacking the last of their moving boxes. The kids excitedly ran throughout the small house, with the family dog hot on their heels. And that's when they quickly realized there was one room they had yet to fully explore. The decision on who would get which bedroom was a discussion yet to come, but they wanted to stake their claim, so the small, energetic group sprinted down the short hallway to the old wooden door firmly shut tight. As is the case with many old doors, as the kids slowly turned the knob, the hinges broke free from their rusted positions and let out a terrible high-pitched squeal that echoed down the hall, the first time in years since anyone had freed them from their closed situation. The noise startled the children at first. They weren't expecting the door itself to scream at them like it had, but when it swung free, they were met with a spine-chilling scene that stuck like a freezing dagger in their backs. There was nothing in the small empty room that stood out to them. There were a few old cobwebs hanging in the corners and a blanket of light dust covering the floor. Aside from that, from what their eyes could tell, there was nothing else in the room. But they knew their eyes were lying to them. The dog was the first to realize something was off and quickly bolted from the doorway as the kids stood frozen in place. They couldn't figure out what it was, but they knew something was in there with them. Something evil was lurking in that room. Suddenly, a thick wall of ice-cold air descended on their small bodies, and they realized it was time to leave. The eldest shuffled their younger siblings out into the hall as quickly as they could and promptly slammed the door shut, blocking off whatever it was that was in there from the rest of the house. The sudden sound of the slamming door earned the kids a light scolding from their mother, but they didn't care. For the rest of the afternoon, they avoided the back room like the plague, and to their parents' displeasure, had found themselves not unpacking like they had originally planned, but rather consoling their children from their fear. Hysteria filled the home that day. The 2 concerned parents knew they had to check out the room. If it had already caused this much trouble before they even got a chance to sleep in the house, they needed to get to the bottom of what set the kids and the dog off, to see if it truly was something to be concerned about. After sending their kids outside to play, both William and Lillian carefully approached the old wooden door, expecting the worst to be just beyond it. But as they flung the door open, nothing was there to greet them. No cold air, nor dark feeling. It seemed like any other room in the house. Wanting to prove to the family there was nothing to fear, William began hauling in and filling the room with furniture. The room itself was so small, though, the only things he was able to fit in there was a small bed and dresser. The idea was, seeing how the kids were so terrified to even enter the room, William decided this would be his, as he would be coming home late from work at the Cadillac plant in the early hours of the morning, so he didn't want to necessarily wake up his wife trying to get into bed, or be disturbed in the early mornings when everyone else was awake. For the rest of the day, the open windows of the house released the stale air that was trapped inside, and despite the little hiccup the children had with the back room, they all grew excited with the thought of spending their first night in the new home. William had already taken some time off work the day before to help move, but was then called back to the factory that same day before he got a chance to spend the night at the house with his family. This didn't bother him too much. Even though he had to work, the thought of spending the night in his new home after his shift proved to help pass work by quickly. And it wasn't long before William found himself back at the home, sneaking through the dimly lit house, doing his best to avoid the creaky wooden floorboards he had discovered early on in the day. The dark room in the back didn't really concern him as he opened up the door. The only thought on his tired mind was finally falling into his soft bed and drifting off to sleep. As he stripped off his work clothes and climbed under the covers, the second he closed his eyes, he fell asleep. But his rest wasn't to last. Without warning, his deep sleep was interrupted by a strange noise emanating just outside the door coming from the hall. He slowly sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes with his fist, and slowly shuffled towards the door. He thought perhaps one of the children were awake and sleepwalking, or the dog might have been scratching at the door needing to go outside, so he reached for the handle ready to open the door, but something stopped him. The doorknob felt like ice. As he gripped it, he recoiled in shock, grasping his stiffened palm with his other hand and stood in confusion. His eyes were still adjusting to the ominous shadows casted in the room, so he couldn't quite tell what might have caused this. So he wrapped his hand in his shirt and quickly turned the knob as fast as he could and opened the door. The wall of blackness that met him in the hall was like none other than he had ever seen before. Even with his eyes finally adjusting to the darkness now, he struggled to make out any form that might have made the noise he had heard. And although he felt eyes on him, he didn't know who they might belong to. The foreboding feeling that shot into William told him to slam the door shut and cut off the rest of the house from him, but his gut also told him to abandon the room and run into the hall. He didn't know what to trust, so he stood there in the doorway, his mind racing but never finding the answer he desperately sought. Peering into the dark curtain that shrouded the hall in an unnatural state, he thought he could have seen a figure slowly shambling towards him, but he couldn't trust his eyes weren't playing tricks on him or not. However, William knew if there was a stranger in the house, it was his duty to protect his family, and if it was his wife or one of his kids sleepwalking, he should at least go over and check on them. William made up his mind right there, and as he took a single step forward before his foot even touched the wooden floor, the figure darted towards him with unnatural speed and flung itself into him. He fell backwards into the room with the body on top of him, and immediately he knew the figure wasn't a member of his family. Now that it wasn't shrouded by the darkness in the hall, William had a full view of the grotesque being that was now lying on top of him. The rotting corpse of a disfigured woman draped itself over him, blood and viscera oozing out of its body, piercing eyes hanging from their sockets, and a discolored tongue now limply resting on William's cheek. Unable to comprehend his predicament, William let out a guttural scream that echoed throughout the entire house that woke everyone from their beds, including himself. Wide-eyed, sweating, pale, and gripping his bedsheets, William abruptly sat up in his bed, completely panicked. That horrible nightmare embedded itself into his brain, leaving him questioning what was real and what was a dream. The shadows in the room caused him further stress. Each one seemed to move on its own without belonging to anything in particular. The creaky floorboards he had avoided earlier when he came home from work began softly making noises just outside his closed door. He began to plead with God that he was awake this time. He couldn't go through it again. But he quickly found out that pinching himself on the arm wouldn't provide him with any such relief. He was awake, and the terror was still approaching. Inch by inch, the doorknob slowly turned and the door slid open. William froze with fear, holding his breath, but thankfully he felt the overwhelming sensation of relief pass over him as he saw his very confused and very tired wife slowly peek in through the crack in the door, asking if he was all right. Not wanting to frighten her, he stiffened up a bit, struggling to find the words, but after several seconds was able to collect himself to meekly tell her he had simply had a nightmare and things were all better now. Now that his wife was awake, William decided staying in the bedroom for the night might not be the best idea. So ripping off his bed sheets, he quickly shuffled Lillian out the door and the two headed to their master bedroom. And while doing so, William looked back at the room behind him. Through the dark shadows of the hall and in the bedroom, he was sure he was able to see an outline of a figure, slowly peeking out from behind the half-open door watching him leave, then ducking further inside the room and disappearing. For the next several nights, William repeated the same routine. He would come home late from his midnight shift at the factory and sneak into the back room in an attempt to sleep without disturbing anyone or being disturbed. But even when the morning sunlight finally emerged, every time without fail he would succumb to horrible nightmares that would wake him in a panic, screaming at the top of his lungs. His wife could see the stress and fear behind his drowsy eyes. Even though he did his best to hide his situation from the rest of the family in an effort to protect them from the horrors of the back room, she still worried for her husband and his mental health. The two discussed perhaps it would be best for William to avoid the back room from now on, and to strictly sleep in their master bedroom when he came home. William also suggested seeing a psychiatrist might be beneficial if the nightmares persisted, but to his relief found he wouldn't have any so long as he didn't sleep in the back room. Avoiding it at night didn't seem to relieve the tension that was in the house during the day. After spending months in the house, the only time someone would enter the room was to grab an article of clothing from the closet. Otherwise, it was left untouched. The children refused to sleep there and opted to share their bedrooms, and William was absolutely against going back inside, so it sat relatively undisturbed. Whatever presence the family felt occupied the room seemed content in staying there. It never ventured beyond the threshold of the hallway and left the rest of the house in peace. Things eventually got out of hand, as they often are wont to do in situations like this. After going quite some time without seeing her great-grandchildren and wanting to spend time with her family before she was too old, William's grandmother insisted on visiting the family in their new home. William, of course, couldn't say no to his dear old grandmother wanting to spend time with him and his family, so she ended up taking the 14-hour bus ride from her home in the state of Georgia all the way to Detroit. Both William and Lillian were concerned where she would end up sleeping, as every bedroom was taken up by the children or themselves, except for the one in the back. They were hesitant when she arrived and insisted it was not a good idea to sleep in the room, even going as far as offering to pay for a nearby hotel for her while she was visiting. But being as stubborn as grandmothers typically are, she told them it was no trouble at all and certainly wasn't going to stay at a hotel after making a 14-hour trip to visit family, especially when there was a perfectly good bedroom available inside the house. Well, William and Lillian relented and decided she was right. If she wanted to stay in the room, she was more than welcome to. They just prayed that whatever presence was in there would leave her alone. When she arrived, the family was of course happy to see her, but in the back of William's mind, after seeing his frail old grandmother walk through the door, he knew it was a mistake to let her stay there. He didn't breach the subject, though, or try to convince her to stay somewhere else again. He knew he would receive another quick scolding by the old woman and it would be a hopeless battle, so he simply took her bags and brought them to the back room. It was the first time he had been back in that room since he officially moved back into the master bedroom with his wife. Even though he was deathly afraid of it, nothing seemed off while he was dropping off the bags. Perhaps whatever it was that was in there wanted to play games and allow William to let down his guard so that he might return to sleep there soon. Or maybe it didn't want him. It wanted to wait until someone new came to stay in the room. Nevertheless, he didn't feel anything, so William believed things would be okay for his grandmother. It wouldn't be until morning would he find out just how wrong he really was. As Lillian was setting the table for breakfast and William herded the children together, the telltale sign of the hall floor boards creaking told the family their grandmother was now awake and coming down to greet them. When Lillian turned around to face her, the look in her tired eyes and pale face sent a feeling of déjà vu down her spine. She had the same exact look her husband had when he had stayed in the room. Not wanting to frighten the children, who already had what seemed like a natural fear of the house at that point, they waited until after breakfast to confront William's grandmother when the children were outside playing. During the entire breakfast, she had remained silent, unable to hide her trembling hands from the eyes of the others. Reluctantly, she told them throughout the entire night terrible sounds, some soft and some loud, would emanate from the dark corners of the room. The suspicious sounds kept her awake for hours, like someone was inside the walls desperately scratching to get out. Then, when she thought her torment couldn't get any worse, the noise in the hall began. At first, it was just sounds of footsteps beyond the door, and she had initially thought it was one of the kids from how faint they were. But then they stopped right outside, and she waited, expecting one of her grandchildren to whisper out to her or to enter the room. The longer she waited for a sign, the more frantic she began to feel. Without anything to say otherwise, she got the feeling whatever was behind the door was not human. At first, the doorknob began to turn, but was stopped. She had locked the door when she had retired for the evening and was now thanking her past self for her nightly routine. Whatever was on the other side of the door, though, wasn't happy about being locked outside the room. The knob began to turn more violently, shaking so much he thought the lock itself was going to break. At the same time, whoever or whatever was trying to get in began slamming itself against the door. Bending against the frame, the old wooden door shook as if it was about to shatter into splinters with each blow. But suddenly it all stopped. A feather could be heard hitting the floor in the silence that followed. The old woman lying in bed clutching her pillow in fear didn't dare to move. The passing hours took their toll on her as she struggled to stay awake, but her adrenaline and fear prevented any rest. Come morning, after hearing the rest of the family moving about the house, she knew it was finally safe to leave her bed, and an hour later found herself nervously sitting at the kitchen table with both William and Lillian unable to speak. They didn't quite know what to say to her. The three sat in silence, in complete disbelief in their situation. After Lillian broke the awkward pause by collecting the dishes, William apologized. He knew she shouldn't have stayed in that room, but hoped since she didn't live in the house, she wouldn't experience anything to that extent. Immediately, he began suggesting the hotel again, but she wouldn't hear of any of it. She was far too shaken by the ordeal to think of staying any longer. That same day, she had William collect her things from the room and drive her to the bus station. The children didn't quite understand why their great-grandmother had to leave so soon, but the parents simply told them there was an emergency she had to attend to. They didn't have the heart to tell their kid she was too afraid of the house and what might be hiding inside. So for the next few months, the room sat empty once more, every member of the family refusing to even enter the hall that led to it. William grew paranoid during this time. Something malicious was in his home, with his family. He knew it was only a matter of time before something happened to one of the children, and he knew he wouldn't be able to live with himself if that were to happen. So thoughts of moving began to dig into the back of his mind. It was around this same time one of William's friends came into town for a visit. Shirley Patterson was passing through the city and decided to take some time off from his trip to stop by the Adams household, as William and him hadn't seen each other for quite some time. William, of course, was happy to see his old friend again, but was concerned once more when Shirley broached the question he had been dreading. Shirley wanted to stay for a couple days to catch up and rest from his trip. William was happy to host his friend, but he knew if he was going to stay, he should warn him of what would await him. The pair sat down around the kitchen table where the two men caught up and shared past stories. It was a pleasant time, but William had that looming thought in his mind just pushing to get out. However, William remembered something in that single moment just before he was about to confess. He remembered Shirley was a no-nonsense type of guy. A man who refused to believe in outlandish stories unless there was proof or practical explanations for them. With no knowledge of the horrifying encounters that accompanied the back room of the house, William suddenly got the idea to test this phenomenon out. With an unbiased opinion and with no previous knowledge or influence going in, William wondered to himself if his friend would experience similar dreams he had once, or heard strange noises like his grandmother once did a few months before. It was maybe unethical to conduct this test on his friend without his realizing, but William was desperate at this point. He wanted to make sure his family was safe, and he hoped the entity in the back room was all in his own mind, a figment of horrid imagination. The drawn-out pause while he was thinking of this plan caused Shirley to ask what was going on up there, referring to William's head. He only smiled and said it was nothing to worry about, and that he hopes he has a restful night. This was only partly true, of course. William was indeed lying when he said there was nothing to worry about, because there was indeed something to worry about. But he was genuine when he wished Shirley a good night's rest. He hoped his friend wouldn't encounter anything like he had. He hoped that it was all in his mind and Shirley would be the one to put it at ease in the morning. He then bid his friend a good night and watched him nervously as Shirley walked away down the narrow hall towards the back room, and slowly clicked the door shut. After driving for hours, his head hitting the feather-filled pillow was a godsend. His heavy eyelids found their place, and so did Shirley, who found himself dipping in and out of consciousness. He wasn't quite asleep yet, but nearly there. That's when he heard something. He was lying on his side, facing towards the wall, so the rest of the room wasn't in his view, but he could have sworn he had heard the same sound made by the bed when he had climbed in. This confused him quite a bit to the point where his brain began waking back up, because obviously he was the only one in the room after locking the door behind him moments ago, and because while there was a sound of someone getting into bed with him, he didn't feel them initially. Just before he was able to have a second thought, invisible hands reached around him and tightly gripped his body, pinning him onto his back. He sat up instantly, looking around the dark room for a culprit, but immediately noticed the bedroom door was wide open now, and a figure was standing in the doorway. His eyes were still adjusting to the darkness, so he leaned in closer to make out that it was a small figure of a woman with long hair. A woman who had her back to him, and was staring out into the hall towards the kitchen. At first, he believed it to have been Lillian, but the feeling in his gut told him this was untrue. She was wearing a long blue dress and fur coat, and her body was slightly swaying back and forth to non-existent music. The dim light that had been left on in the kitchen provided enough glow to allow Shirley to see everything with complete clarity now, so standing up out of bed, he slowly tiptoed towards the swaying woman and grabbed her shoulder to turn her around. As he did, the horrifying smile of a green, grotesque face turned to meet his, and in doing so, Shirley let out an incredible yell that echoed throughout the house. The figure then disappeared into thin air as he attempted to scramble past her and towards the hall. The few lights that were left on in the house began to flicker uncontrollably as he left the room. Then they shut off completely as he tried to navigate the hall with his arms outstretched. Upon feeling the cold floor of the kitchen beneath his feet, Shirley desperately reached for the light, only to feel the sensation of cold skin already beating him to the switch. With another scream of pure fear, the light turned on, and there stood Lillian, pale-faced and wide-eyed, staring at the panicked man. To say the immense relief Shirley felt in that moment after seeing a friendly and not decaying face would have been an understatement. With huge sighs of relief, the two stood in the empty kitchen, afraid to breach the awkward silence between them. Lillian knew what had caused her friend to flee from the room in terror, but was hesitant to acknowledge it. Shirley looked deeply into Lillian's eyes as if asking without words what the hell was going on. But before Lillian could even offer up an explanation, the ear-shadowing wailing of what sounded half human, half animal reverberated out of the back room, down the hall, and filled the house to its entirety. William had already left by this time to make it to his midnight shift at the factory, so Lillian and Shirley were on their own to protect the kids from this horrid phantom. The screaming emanating from the room had now ceased, only to be replaced by a faint moaning melody, and with it came the stench. A putrid smell wafting throughout the house filled the adults' nostrils with the unfamiliar scent of rotting death, forcing the two to gag in disgust. More violent banging echoed throughout the house, only this time it wasn't coming from the back room, but rather from a small utility closet near the kitchen. Bravely approaching the closet door with Lillian following hot on his heels, Shirley threw the old door open for both to witness the trapdoor inside lifting several inches off the ground, then slamming back down into its frame. Beneath was the old flimsy stairs that led down into the cramped, unlit, unfinished basement that nobody had dared venture down into during the short residency. The two stared at each other again, unable to come up with any reason as to why the trapdoor was flying open and closed all on its own. But this discovery made Lillian realize something. Whatever this thing was, it was no longer restricted to the small bedroom. With this dawning on Lillian, the welfare of her children's safety became her priority. She took off running in a sprint towards their bedrooms while yelling back at Shirley to call the police. Whatever this intruder was that was terrorizing their home, they needed help in dealing with it. They couldn't ignore it any longer. Lillian shuffled the children out of their beds and onto the front lawn of the house at the same time as Shirley was finishing up with his phone call to the police. As she looked back into her home one last time that night, and Shirley hung the handset of the phone back onto the wall, the sounds of the creaking, moaning house seemed to move closer to the front door, as if the noise itself was forcing everyone out. The two remaining occupants in the house knew there was no time to spare, and they bolted from the front door to the grass where the children were waiting. They watched in horror as the shadows filled the home inside, and the front door slowly shut itself behind them. When the police arrived, they found the family uncontrollably shaking in the front yard. Nothing they could say or do would make sense to the officers responding, and no matter how hard they tried, the police couldn't calm the panicking family. Through their ramblings, the officers were able to discern someone or something had been harassing the family inside their home, so it was enough to convince them to do a short investigation inside to determine if anything could be found. They searched throughout the entire house from top to bottom, starting in the dusty, untouched attic. When nothing but cobwebs could be found up there, they worked their way from room to room, spending most of their time in the back bedroom where Lillian had instructed them was the most active location. But again, nothing was found out of the ordinary. They slowly walked down the narrow, rickety stairs into the unfinished basement, but yet again, nothing was wrong. Heading back outside, the defeated officers assured the family there was nothing inside the house. Every closet was checked. They looked behind every piece of furniture for anyone possibly hiding inside. There was no possible way someone else had been inside the house without them noticing. They told Lillian and Shirley it was likely okay for them to re-enter the home, and if something did occur again, to give them a call immediately, and they would be there within a few minutes as they were patrolling in the area anyways. Lillian, her kids, and Shirley watched in disbelief as the police drove off down the street, unknowing what to say to one another due to the fact the police hadn't experienced anything, even though just an hour ago the group thought they were all going to die by the hands of a malicious spirit. With all that had happened that night, the two adults decided to stay awake while their children slept. William was going to be done his night shift in a couple hours, so they wanted to be awake when he got home so they could explain what had happened. When he finally pulled up to the curb outside the house and saw the lights still on through the kitchen window, William, almost instinctively, knew what had happened and why his wife and friend were still awake sitting at the table waiting for him as he entered. He approached the table and sat down, hanging his tired face in both hands, racing to come up with an explanation to Shirley. It was awkward, but William got through his explanation. He confessed since he knew Shirley was a man who had no previous knowledge of what was going on in the house and was a natural-born skeptic when it came to paranormal encounters and events, he had thought there might be a chance he wouldn't experience anything, and proved to him and Lillian that there was nothing to truly fear, as if it was all in their heads. But now confirmation was there. Whatever was happening in that house was real, and after hearing about the events of the night from Lillian and Shirley, William decided he had had enough. His family was his priority, and whatever this thing was now overstepping its boundaries. He could have accepted the back room was its space, and they would have the rest of the house. But now things were different, and it was time to settle things once and for all. The sun passed by slowly over the Adams house that day as everyone inside dreaded what was coming. The showdown between William and the spirit was near, and by 7:30 William settled down in the old rickety bed in the back room, taunting the spirit to come forth and face him. For nearly an hour, William laid motionless on top of the covers with his eyes closed, as if he was trying to lure whatever it was to finally reveal itself into thinking he was asleep. With nothing but a maddening sound of the ticking clock giving William an idea of how long he had been in there, he was just about to give up after his ears couldn't take it any longer. But just seconds before he was about to open his eyes, he heard what he thought was Lillian opening the door and walking into the room. He thought she was coming in to check on him, so he whispered out to her to leave as it likely wasn't going to show itself if there were two of them in there. Lillian, however, didn't respond. He knew he had heard someone open the door and entered the room and assumed it was his wife due to the soft footsteps he heard, but when she didn't say anything back to him, William began to get nervous. He decided to open his eyes, sit up in bed, and take a look. He didn't see anyone, but he felt another presence in the room with him. Lying back down in the same position he was in before, he wanted to continue, to pressure the spirit to reveal itself to him. And it certainly did. The moment William's back hit the bed, something felt off from before. After being married for years at this point, he knew the sensation well. Someone was right next to him, lying in the bed. He slowly turned over to his side to see a figure, the same horrifying face from his first dream. Just inches away, its dead, cloudy eyes stared intently into his own. Her mouth began to slowly move, as if trying to speak, but only a light hissing sound was passing through her decaying lips. William didn't want to wait around to find out what she had to say, so in a fit of hysteria, he jumped out of bed and sprinted out of the bedroom screaming. Both Lillian and Shirley were still awake and in the living room, waiting for him to come out, but when they tried asking him what had happened, William just couldn't compose himself and continued to yell at the top of his lungs. When the obnoxious smell of death permeated throughout the house like it had the previous night, unable to contain his fear, William began ripping chunks of hair from his scalp in a fit of panic. Lillian screamed at the sight of blood trickling down her husband's face, while Shirley attempted to restrain the man. But running off pure adrenaline, William effortlessly threw his friend to the ground, so Lillian was quick to react and covered the flailing man and wrapped him in a wool blanket. Shirley bolted right back up and rushed to join her in containing him, and the two held William for nearly an hour together, until he was finally able to collect his composure and his senses returned. William had lost. The hag had won. Not only did she win dominance over the back room, but the entire house. The three adults admitted defeat and woke the children from their beds, and that very same night the house sat empty. Everyone had retreated to a neighbor's house across the street for help, and then to Lillian's mother's just 10 minutes away in the morning. Over the next 2 weeks, only during the daylight hours, with the help of relatives and friends, the Adams secured an apartment to rent and moved their furniture out of the home. But the horrible hag of Detroit wasn't quite finished with the family just yet. On a trip to the house to collect their sister's belongings, Lillian's brother Leo and her sister Virginia walked through the front door with nothing but skepticism on their minds. The wild tale of nightmares caused by the spirit of a horrible old woman in the back room was one they couldn't necessarily believe on blind faith. Leo wanted to see if what his sister and brother-in-law had been so worked up about was true, so he decided to go lie down on the bed for a few minutes to see if anything happened to him, while Virginia waited down the hall and watched the room from a distance. Virginia recalled not even at the 10-minute mark, she could hear terrible groans coming from the room that definitely didn't belong to Leo. Within seconds after it had started, Leo came rushing from the room and into the kitchen, with a look of pure terror plastered on his face. No matter what she said, Virginia couldn't convince Leo to reveal to her what had happened in that room when he was inside. So the two decided it was best to vacate the house for now, and to come back later with the others to finish moving the remaining furniture. Both William and Lillian were beyond relieved when the last of their things were hauled out of that house on Martin Street. Their nightmare had finally ended, and they were safe from whatever dwelled inside. Since then, news of anything else happening behind those walls has yet to be brought to light. Any kind of evidence is non-existent. We solely must rely on the story shared by William and Lillian all those years ago. The reason for this is because the current owners of the house outright refuses to allow any paranormal investigators to enter and conduct their tests. Over the years, hundreds of people have attempted to beg for permission to enter, offering large sums of cash in exchange, but every time they are either ignored or turned away. Interpret this as you will. Perhaps the owner doesn't want such a large number of people coming to the house, possibly damaging the property in some way. Maybe they don't want word to get out that the story of the house is false and everything was simply concocted by past residents. Or is the story true, and the owner, by turning away the public, is attempting to protect those who come looking to investigate? The modest house at 5508 Martin Street still stands to this day, and judging by the neatly kept yard and flowers growing in the front, seen on Google Earth Street View, someone is still living there, or at the very least is taking care of the property. Perhaps we don't necessarily want to know what's really going on in there, or at least don't want to risk an encounter with the Hag of Detroit. If it is real and the story is true, if it's contained to that house, it might be best not to have a bunch of paranormal teams going in an attempt to provoke an interaction. Who knows what it might be capable of if it can twist one's mind to produce nightmares and visions. As I so often like to do when we're near the end of an episode, I typically like to ask, what happened here? What could have happened on the property to have stirred up such an intense story? There are things in this life we can simply not explain. Ghost stories are so common, nearly every community in the world has one or two to share. Oftentimes, though, the presence of logical explanations for existing evidence, or lack of any evidence, often proves the stories to be false. With this particular case, however, we don't have any evidence to necessarily say this happened or it didn't. We mainly only have the word of those involved to go off of, and that's hardly enough evidence to say the events of this story were true with absolute certainty. So as I often like to do in the show, is look into logical explanations as to what could have possibly been going on here. The house where the story takes place is fairly old. At the time in the story when William and his family moved in, it was the early 1960s. I believe it was 1962 to be exact. We know they didn't build the house, so we can assume it had been standing on the lot for several years before they had moved in. Now, typically older houses are not often built in a way to allow proper ventilation. Small cracks in the walls, ceilings, or floorboards can allow gas or fumes to flow throughout the house relatively unhindered. In the 1960s, older homes would have been heated by using either oil, propane, or natural gas to run the furnaces, stoves, or boilers. In this particular case, there could have been a chance for a small carbon monoxide leak in the home, which would have affected those who entered and stayed in the house for an extended period of time. Just like any gas, carbon monoxide can be dissipated by opening doors and windows to allow it to vent out. In the story, we know each member of the Addams family were extremely hesitant on even opening the door to the back room. If the bedroom is sealed for lengthy periods of time, those who eventually went into it to sleep will be walking, then sleeping in a room full of odorless, invisible poison. So what does carbon monoxide do to the human body? Well, the obvious is death, but it can also lead to spouts of dizziness, causing an individual to faint and vomit uncontrollably. It can bring on weakness, headaches, and as well as confusion and hallucinations. The lack of oxygen reaching the brain can produce visual and auditory hallucinations that might not really be there, but are fully believed to be real. Carbon monoxide isn't the only culprit we could point to either. Remember in the story, it's mentioned at one point the small hatch that led into the unfinished dirt basement was lifting all on its own. The key information here that we need to pay attention to is the unfinished dirt basement. Now think about this. Where does mold typically form? In dark, damp, earthy environments. The untouched basement could very well have become a breeding ground for toxic mold to form, which would then cause hallucinations as well as psychosis. Disruptions to a person's thoughts and perceptions, especially in the dark, could make it extremely difficult for them to recognize what is real and what might not be. This is the truth for many haunted locations around the world. Typically, if one were to classify a specific building as being haunted, that building is usually several decades old, creating an environment where mold could easily form. Whether toxic mold or carbon monoxide is the culprit for this particular case, it remains to be discovered. These are simply just scientific explanations I personally would say is what was causing the issues back in the 60s. Perhaps with the development of cleaner heating systems over the years, if the house did have a small gas leak, it likely has been fixed by now, decades later after the incident. If there was toxic mold in the unfinished basement, maybe over the course of the past 70 years or so, the basement had become finished and the mold cleaned out. If the mold and/or carbon monoxide has been dealt with, this would explain why we haven't heard any more horrifying stories coming out of that house, especially when it seems like it's still being lived in. Whatever the horrible hag of Detroit who terrorized a family and forced them to flee from the home truly was, if it was a malicious spectral phantom or toxic gas, it seems today the modest house at 5508 Martin Street has since remained quiet. Perhaps with the passage of time, whatever entity that was believed to inhabit the home has since found her peace and rest. Or as the home developed into the modern age and upgrades to the house began, the dangerous fumes inside the home has since dissipated, leaving it to be far more livable than when the Addams family had lived there. Whatever might be the case, this story serves as a good reminder to us all. As safe as we might feel in our own homes, sometimes the most dangerous things can be found waiting inside. Thank you for joining me for this incredibly interesting story. I had a lot of fun writing it and I hope you enjoyed hearing it. This probably goes without saying though, but I feel like I should mention it. If you've become enraptured with this story, I ask you please don't disturb whoever is currently living at the address where it takes place. The owner of the home has made it very clear over the years that they're not interested in paranormal investigations taking place at the house, so please respect their wishes and allow them to live in peace. I know the audience for this show is pretty mature and respectful, so I'm sure I don't need to say anything, but I figured I'd throw it in there just to be safe. If you did enjoy the episode though, please consider leaving a 5-star review on whatever app you're listening on. It only just takes a second to do and goes an incredibly long way in helping the podcast grow. Another way in helping with that is by sharing the show with your friends and family, either by posting the episodes onto social media or using word of mouth. Any support you guys give is greatly appreciated. And if you want to go a step further, the show also has a Patreon page where you can donate as little as $5 a month and gain access to monthly bonus episodes not available for the rest of the public. I cover similar stories on there as I do on these main feeds, so if you're looking for a little bit more Moonlight Lore, head on over to Patreon and sign up. Your donations go a long way in helping cover the costs of running the show. If you ever wanted to get into contact me, whether it's to discuss a topic I talk about on here, share a story of your own, or just you want to say hi, you could send me a message by email at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram at moonlightlorepodcast. I always love hearing from you guys, so never hesitate to reach out. I will always respond to your messages. Anyways, guys, I think that's it for this episode, so thank you so much for joining me and listening. I'll catch you guys in a couple weeks with a new episode, so I'll see you then, and take care.